Xavier Mertz got the softest food, the easiest to chew, the most nourishing part of every animal they killed. Douglas Mawson ate the scraps. Mertz died on the 8th of January. Mawson walked home. To understand how that happened, go back 4 weeks, to a snow bridge on the polar plateau. It held for the first 2 men. It held for the first sledge. It held for the second sledge. Belgrave Ninnis was walking beside the third when the ground stopped existing. There was no sound. That was the part the survivors could never explain afterward. A crevasse the width of a room opened under a man, 6 dogs, a tent, and almost every ounce of food 3 men had left, and it made no noise at all. Douglas Mawson turned around because the dogs behind him had gone quiet. He was 31 years old, a geologist, and he was standing 315 miles from the nearest human being who knew his name. It was the 14th of December, 1912. The 2 men still alive on that ice would spend the next month learning something about the human body that nobody had written down yet, and one of them would not survive the lesson. You know the shape of a survival story. Someone is stranded, someone endures, someone walks out. What happened to the Far Eastern Party does not fit that shape, because the thing that killed the second man was not the cold, and it was not starvation, and it was not the ice. It was the food. Start earlier. Mawson had been to Antarctica before, with Shackleton, and he had turned down a place on Scott's expedition to run his own. The Australasian Antarctic Expedition landed at Cape Denison in January 1912, at a spot that turned out to be the windiest place at sea level on the entire planet. The wind there averaged 50 miles an hour for months. Men crawled between huts. They learned to walk leaning forward at an angle that would have put them face down anywhere else in the world. From that hut, Mawson sent out sledging parties in the spring. He led one himself east into unmapped territory. With him went Xavier Mertz, a Swiss lawyer and champion skier, and Belgrave Ninnis, a young British lieutenant. 17 dogs, 3 sledges, a plan to map coastline nobody had ever drawn. Understand what they were walking into. Not a landscape. A wind machine. The katabatic wind at Cape Denison comes off the polar plateau under its own weight. Cold air pouring downhill toward the sea and accelerating the whole way, and it does not stop for weather or season. Mawson's men recorded gusts near 200 miles an hour. They built a hut and then spent a year unable to stand upright outside it. When they went out to work, they carried ice picks and drove them into the ground to hold position. And they developed a way of walking that involved leaning so far into the air that a sudden lull would drop them on their faces. That was the base. East of it was nothing anyone had ever surveyed. They rotated the sledges as they went. The rearmost sledge carried the most, so it got the strongest dog team, and it went last because the men ahead would have already tested the surface. That was the logic. It was good logic. It is the reason Ninnis was in the position he was in on the 14th of December, and it is the reason the food was on his sledge and not on Mawson's. They stood at the lip and shouted down for 3 hours. There was a ledge 150 feet below with 2 dead dogs on it and a piece of canvas. Below that, nothing they could see. They had no rope long enough. Mawson read the burial service over the hole, and they turned west. Now count what they had. 10 days of food for 2 men. No tent. 6 dogs, all of them the weakest ones, already failing. 315 miles between them and the hut. That arithmetic does not work. It does not come close to working. Every honest reckoning of those numbers ends with 2 dead men on the plateau. And the only reason it did not is that they made a decision on the first night that would save one of them and kill the other. They decided to eat the dogs. This was not unusual. Polar expeditions had done it before and would do it again. A working sledge dog is meat you have already carried with you. The men fed the dog meat to the surviving dogs, and they ate the rest themselves, and they took what fat and organ tissue they could, because they were burning something like 5,000 calories a day and taking in a fraction of that. The livers went to the men. The livers were soft, and the men's teeth and jaws were failing, and the muscle meat of a starved sled dog is nearly inedible stringy rope. So Mawson and Mertz ate the livers. Mertz, who did not like the taste of the tough meat, ate more liver than Mawson did. Remember that detail? It matters more than anything else in this story. Picture the actual work of it. The dogs were dying anyway, so the weakest went first, and the two men had to do it themselves at the end of a day's hauling, with a knife, in the wind, in front of the other dogs. Then the butchering, which on a starved animal yields almost nothing. Mertz recorded that the meat was tough and tasteless, and that boiling it for hours barely changed it. They kept the paws, and they stewed them, because there was cartilage in a paw, and cartilage was calories. They walked. They dragged a half sledge with a makeshift tent, cover held up by spare runners, and they walked west into the wind, and the dogs died one by one and were eaten. Mawson's diary from those weeks is a flat, precise document. He records distances. He records the weather. He records without comment the day the last dog was killed. Then, in early January, Mertz stopped being able to walk. At first Mawson thought it was the cold. Mertz was the stronger skier, the fitter man, the one everybody would have bet on. But Mertz was losing skin. It came off his legs and his hands in sheets. His hair came out. He became confused, then irritable, then violent. At one point he bit off the end of his own finger. On the 6th of January he could not leave the sleeping bag. Mawson hauled him on the sledge for a day. On the 8th of January 1913, Xavier Mertz died in that tent. Mawson was alone, 100 miles out, and his own skin was coming off in the same way. Here is what nobody in that tent could have known. Vitamin A is stored in the liver. In most animals the amount is manageable. In the dog it is concentrated, and in a sled dog fed on seal, and its own kind it can be extraordinarily concentrated. Taken in a large enough dose over a short enough period, vitamin A stops being a nutrient and becomes a poison. It attacks skin, hair, bone, and eventually the brain. The condition is called hypervitaminosis A, and it was not described in the medical literature until the 1930s, 2 decades after Mertz was buried in the snow. That is the explanation you will find in most accounts of this expedition. It was proposed in a 1969 paper by Sir John Cleland and R.V. Southcott, and it fits the symptoms with unsettling precision. It is also, honestly, contested. Later researchers have pointed out that the timing does not perfectly match, that starvation and extreme cold and psychological collapse produce overlapping symptoms, and that we cannot autopsy a man who has been in the ice for over a century. What is not contested is the pattern in front of Mawson's eyes. The man who ate more of the liver got sicker, faster, and died. Mawson buried him under snow blocks, made across from sledge runners, and started walking. He cut the sledge in half with a pocket knife to reduce the weight. He threw away the camera plates and kept the geological samples, which tells you something about what he thought he was doing out there. And then the soles of his feet came off. Not blistered. Detached. He wrote that the skin of both soles separated as a complete layer, and he bound them back on with bandages and pulled his socks over the top, and kept walking on them. 30 miles later he fell into a crevasse, and was stopped by his own sledge harness, hanging in the dark on a rope, 14 feet down, with no strength in his arms. He hung there and considered cutting himself loose. He wrote about it afterward without drama. Then he climbed the rope, knot by knot, and got a knee over the lip, and fell back in, and climbed it again. Think about what that second climb costs. Not the first one. The first one is adrenaline and reflex. The second one, after the ice has already given way once, after you know exactly how much is left in your arms, is a decision made by a man with every reason to stop. After that he rigged a rope ladder to the sledge harness and trailed it behind him for the rest of the journey, so that the next time the ice opened, he would have something to climb. It opened again. He used the ladder. He was doing arithmetic every night, in a diary written by a man whose fingers were coming apart, working out how many miles he had to make per day against how much food remained. And the number kept moving in the wrong direction. He kept walking. In late January, he found a snow cairn left by a search party from the hut with food in it and a note. The note told him the ship, the Aurora, was waiting, and it told him the date. He was close. On the 8th of February, 1913, Mawson came over the last rise above Cape Denison and looked down at the bay. The Aurora was a smudge on the horizon, already gone, sailing away. It had left that same day. Hours. 6 men were still standing on the shore. They had volunteered to stay behind on the chance that Mawson was alive, and they were the reason this story has a survivor in it. They got him inside. They radioed the ship, which turned around and could not get back in through the weather, and finally had to leave for the season. Mawson spent another full Antarctic winter at Cape Denison, in the windiest place on Earth, recovering in the same hut he had left healthy a year before. He came home in 1914. He was knighted. He went back to Antarctica twice. He put Mertz and Ninnis on the map, permanently, in the names of 2 glaciers. Now go back to that first night after the crevasse. 2 men, 10 days of food, 315 miles. They made the only reasonable decision available to them. They ate what they had. They gave the softest, most digestible part to the man whose teeth were failing. Every step of that reasoning is sound. Every step of it is what you would have done, and what a careful, intelligent, trained person would have done, and it killed Xavier Mertz. That is the part of this story that stays with you. Your instinct is to look for the mistake, because survival stories are supposed to have one, and finding it is how you reassure yourself that you would have gone home. There was no mistake. There was a nutrient that nobody on Earth knew was dangerous, hidden inside the only food 2 men had, and the harder they tried to survive, the more of it they ate. You do this constantly, on a smaller scale. You make decisions with the information available, and you assume that a good process produces a good outcome. Most of the time, the gap between those 2 things is small enough that you never see it. Mawson and Mertz stood in a place where the gap was total, where doing everything right and dying were the same act, and only one of them walked out to describe it. Xavier Mertz got the softest food. He got the easiest to chew, the most nourishing part of every animal they killed, and he got it because 2 men who cared whether he lived looked at what they had and gave him the best of it. Douglas Mawson ate the scraps, and the scraps are the reason he came home. The thing that took Ninnis at least announced itself with a hole in the ground. What took Mertz was handed to him across a stove by a friend in kindness.